Am I supposed to? There we go. Am I supposed to make a joke now?
Not just yet. Hold off just 1 minute. And then I also want to make sure that I've set it up that you can, that if you have a joke to share with us, this would be the perfect time to share that joke.
I strained my brain and I came up with one.
Okay.
Okay. What has happened was this highway patrolman came upon this wreck. This car had hit the tree and all the people were unconscious. And there was a monkey there too. And so while he's waiting on the ambulances and everything, because it was out in the country, he thought, well, I'll see if that monkey can give me any information whatsoever. So he went over there and he asked the monkey, well, what was Dad doing? And he kind of went like this with his eyes closed and thought, oh yeah. So he wrote down, he was sleeping. So he said, well, what was Mom doing? And then he holds up and she was yakking. So he said, well, what are the kids doing? And he goes, oh, okay. And he writes down, they were fighting. And so that accounted for everybody. And he didn't really know too much. And I said, well, what were you doing? And he goes, there's the problem. He was driving.
The monkey was driving.
That was the best I could do.
That was funny.
All right. That was good. Okay. I'm Terry Camerzell here with Creation Fellowship CNT, and we're a group of friends bound by our common agreement that the creation account, as told in Genesis, is a true depiction of how God created the universe and all life from nothing in just 6 days a few thousand years ago. We've been meeting here on Zoom Fellowship most Thursday nights since June of 2020. We've been blessed with presentations by pastors, teachers, doctors, cartoonists, scientists, apologists, and all around smarty pants people who love the Lord and have a message to share. You can find most of our past videos by searching Creation Fellowship SANTEE, that's SANTEE on YouTube. We're actually working on setting up our Rumble account as well. You can follow us on our Creation Fellowship Facebook page, and you can sign up for our email list by emailing creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com so you don't miss any upcoming speakers. Tonight, we're blessed to have with us Stan Bryant. Stan was raised on a farm near Burdett in Pawnee County, Kansas. He graduated from Pawnee Heights High School in 1968 and received an AA degree from St. John's Lutheran College in Winfield, Kansas in 1970. The next year, he transferred to Biola College in La Mirada, California, and pursued a Christian education degree for 2 semesters. Later, he graduated from Rawhide Vocational College in California with training for Western Ranch youth camps. He then moved back to Kansas and farmed for 10 years with his father. Stan has been pastoring Roselle Christian Fellowship from 1985 to the present. He also drove a school bus for 28 years. Stan is currently president of the board for Heart of America Science Resource Center in Haviland, Kansas. And he met Susan, his wife, at St. John's College and was married in 1973. They have 2 married daughters, one living in Texas and one in Montana, and 6 grandchildren. God led Stan to start a creation science ministry over 20 years ago because widespread evolutionary teaching causes people to doubt their Christian faith. And with that, we're happy to welcome Stan. Stan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And I really consider it a privilege to be able to share with different people the things that I've learned, and I'm just thankful for the opportunity. So we're going to be looking at the flood, the ice age, and the Bible. Caleb said something's missing here. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay. All right. The flood, the ice age, and the Bible. And to me, you can't really talk about the ice age unless you go a little bit into the flood. So we're going to start there. One of the pictures that I got is, of this lady, and some of you probably see a young lady, and some of you probably see an old lady, and some of you see both. but it's interesting within the, the geologic column in the world and the evidence we would see for the flood or the geologic column. Some see it as being very old and some see it as relatively new. So that's the reason I got that picture there. And I don't know, I'll kind of point it out a little bit. Here's the jaw of the young lady. I'm not used to a mouse. There's the jaw, there's her nose, there's an ear. Here's the mouth of the old lady, and the jawbone of the young lady is the nose of the old lady. And this is an eye and an eyelash of both of them. So anyway, it just depends on how we're looking, what we're looking at. We can look at the same information and come up with two different scenarios or two different conclusions from that. So let's keep going. We'll look at the flood first. On the flood, is there historical evidence that fits the biblical flood account? And I'm just going to read the yellow to save some time. In Genesis chapter 7, 10 to 12, it says, all the fountains of the great deep were risen, and the windows of heavens were opened up, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So it is an account in the Bible. And if we just look at the Bible as a historical book, it is talked about. Then also, this is an old slide. And at this time, there were 270 flood legends and historical records found around the world. And the last I read in Michael Ord's book, there were 349 legends around the world. Many of those talk about one family being saved, building some kind of a floating craft and taking animals on board, which is very similar. Now in the red box there, I'm going to read that. It says, the earth was shaken to its foundations. The sky sank lower towards the north. The sun, moon, and stars changed their motions. The earth fell to pieces, and the waters in its bosom rushed upward with violence and overflowed the earth. Man had rebelled against the high gods, and the system of the universe was in disorder. It's kind of interesting, even though it's different, it's really got the same theme all the way through. I do want to mention about the sun and moon and stars change their motions. And one of the things that, if you spin a top, you probably did that when you was a kid anyway. And if you just barely touched the top, it would begin to wobble. Well, if you had huge earthquakes, continents moving and everything going like that, it would like put it out of balance. And so the earth spinning on the axis probably wobbled. And that would make the sun, moon, and stars appear that their motions had changed. And then the other aspect, it rebelled against the high gods. Well, by that time it had deteriorated in China there. And by the way, this was found in a work that was supposed to contain all knowledge at the time out of China. We keep going. We'll just look at the top box there. And one of the things there and this is Chinese writing, and the first symbol there is of a vessel. And then the next symbol down is for the number 8. And then the next is for people or mouths. So the word for boat is a vessel with 8 people on it. And if you count the people that the Bible says went on the ark, you would end up with 8 people. So that's further verification historically that there's something to what the Bible has talked about. Now, is there any scientific evidence that fits a biblical flood account? And we look at the geologic column that's there, and did the layers form quickly, or did those layers form over vast ages of time? It's like, do we see the old woman or the young woman in our perspective concerning the geologic column? One of the things that we can look at is the Institute for Creation Research, Brian Thomas. He's an oil geologist, and this was in the Acts and Facts magazine from ICR in August 2015. And what he did was he took samples of the geologic column, top to bottom, all around the world. And within that, it was almost 50 samples. And because of that, every sample contains some measurable amount of carbon-14. Well, if something is more than 100,000 years old, there should be no measurable amount of carbon-14. So that is radiometric dating evidence that the Earth is much younger than what the evolutionary people would say that it is. And this fits with a young Earth account way more than the old Earth account. A lot of the stuff that I'll be presenting this evening is taken from Dr. Walter Brown's book, In the Beginning. And by the way, his book is in its entirety on the internet if anybody wants to look it up and go through it. Dr. Brown worked for NASA and taught at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. He's an engineer. So you see the picture to the right there is where he depicts the fountains of the deep breaking open, the crust of the earth cracked open, and there was tremendous amounts of water down in the earth, and it began to explode upwards. I just should quit there. And here's just a couple pictures of the beginning of that maybe taking place. And I assure you, anybody, I don't know how close, but if you're very close at all, you would probably be burned to death and steamed to death because it would have been extremely hot and extreme pressure. Now, he says there was a lot of water down under the crust of the earth somewhere. It may not be in a solid, like a solid lake under there, like the picture depicts. It may have been in chambers, and we're not sure about that. And actually, secular science, I may have the exact amount. I think I'm safe to say that even secular science is now saying that 400 miles down in the earth is about 3/4 of the amount of water that's on the surface. And it's in a mineral called ringwoodite. So it's not, it's not unscientific to think that at some time there was a lot of water underneath the earth. There's evidence for it. In fact, 10% of what comes out of a volcano now is water that's never been to the surface before. And then as that exploded upward in that crack, it began to erode the sides. And as it continued to flow and erode the sides, the softer part of the earth inside began to bulge up. And as it got far enough, probably towards the end of the flood, the continents began to slide away from that ridge. And that's the Mid-Atlantic Ocean ridge depicted here, and we'll show more in detail later. And as it got far enough, then it began to slide. Now, as you will see in this, Dr. Brown thinks that this is about where South America and Africa was when that crack split open. And all of this material in here, he says, is approximately the same amount as the sedimentary rock that we find around the world. And then it would have slid from this location, and this is where the western edge of South America is today, and Africa is over here. So it would have slid quite a ways. Now let's look at what the Bible would say about that. It says, the water stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. The mountains rose, the valley sank down unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they may not turn again to cover the earth. And one of the things that evolutionists say, oh, you crazy Christians, there's not near enough water to cover the earth. It's just stupid. Well, God says right there that he made it to where it couldn't cover the earth again. But they're assuming the oceans were as deep and the mountains were as tall as they were now. But if you bring the ocean bottoms down and the mountains, or the up and the mountains down, there's enough water to cover the earth by 1.5 miles thick. So it just depends on your assumptions and what you choose to believe. Now, this is another picture of the earth and where those cracks were. Now, Dr. Brown thinks that, of course, this crack that you can see in different parts all around the earth is where that crack occurred. And notice Iceland would be a volcano that erupted enough material that came through and is now Iceland. And then if you look out here in this, you can't see it in this picture as much, but you get a more detailed picture, and there are thousands and thousands of volcanoes that, are just on the bottom of the ocean floor. So there's been tremendous amount of volcanic activity going on. Then Dr. Brown says that the mountains on both North and South America and even around the world are always parallel to where he says the crack was. And as these continents begin to slide again towards the end part of the flood, and then the other end, there was probably less water, more and more friction. And then eventually the western slope, in this case, stopped. And so the mountains would have built up very quickly. For some reason, my clicker quit. Sure.
Turn off.
No, there we go. Okay.
All is good? Okay.
Yep, all's good. No telling what happened. Stan's running it. That's the main problem. If the earth was covered with water, you would have had tremendous tides. Dr. Brown says that there would have been a 200-foot tidal bulge that circled the earth twice a day as it just slightly followed the moon circling the earth. Now, you do that and you would have, about, I estimated 200 gallon coffee cans would end up with about 1,700 pounds of pressure. That would be when the bulge was over an area of the soft sediments that were just laid down. It would be about 1,700 pounds of pressure squishing down into that. And then when it goes by, that water has to get out. It's the same process as when you're walking along the beach and a wave goes, and covers your feet and everything's okay. But when the wave goes out, your foot sinks down. That's the process, or the scientific process, of liquefaction. And what that does is it begins to sort things into layers. And I made a demonstration that Walt Brown talked about with 2-liter bottles, and I connected them with a tube, and the one with the dirt and different particles of sand and dirt in it has a screen on it. And then as you raise the bottle that has the water in it, and it goes and starts going up through the dirt and gravel in the other bottle, it sorts it into layers. And you can just demonstrate that. We took it to a homeschool convention and everybody was really watching that, and it was quite a deal. It's a good thing to do. Now, if the fountains of the deep eroded tremendous amounts of sediments, there should be some evidence of sediments covering large areas of the land. And so I'm not going to spend hardly any time, but I want to kind of go through some different slides showing large areas of sediments. Now, evolutionists, at least books I've read and gone to different museums and stuff, they say, well, look, this local flood did this and trapped the dinosaurs here, and this local flood here and there. Well, you can't explain these huge layers with local floods. It about has to be a worldwide flood. This moves on to volcanoes, and you can see that sometime in the past, like the blue over here, is much larger than like Mount St. Helens here. And it's, in other words, the severity of the volcanoes have decreased over time. And this is a lava flow. This is Washington and Oregon, and it covers 100,000 square miles, and it's about a mile thick. So there'd be tremendous, we can't even imagine probably how vast and how severe the volcanoes were at that time. And this is, I know you guys are in California, but this is a picture of the general geologic column in Kansas. To the left is the western end, and to the right is the eastern end. And notice the Precambrian is here. And so this would have been about the time of the flood. This would be the ground level. And then it starts to go up and add sedimentary layers. I want you to take note, the first 3 layers are very thin. Now, secular geology says that Kansas was an inland lake, or an inland lake sometime in the past. And yet Timothy Clary from ICR is an oil geologist, and he says he thinks it was actually higher because as the floodwaters rose, those layers are very thin in the beginning because it was higher, and probably might even have been the tides that would have just washed over and left a little bit of sediment there. And then as the water covered more and more of the earth, then those layers got thicker and thicker. Then when the mountains rose up and the valley sank down, see, these layers probably would have extended clear over to here, about this high, but it eroded these off as water came off the mountains in the area and then went down the Mississippi River. So that's a possible explanation there. Just real quickly, this is Tim Clary's illustration that's in the Acts and Facts, February 2015 on page 16. And he's showing that he thinks this area was higher because those first 3 layers that are very thin here is up to, 2/3 of a mile thick here, and here with holes being 3 kilometers thick. And those might be areas where fountains of the deep actually broke open on the continent. So anyway, that's some further evidence of maybe how the flood was and how the earth was before the flood. Now, most of you probably know that a lot of places this is a picture of a 30-foot petrified tree. The bottom and the top are both in coal seams. Well, if a tree dies, it stands up for a period of time, but it doesn't stand up for thousands and thousands of years, waiting on the layers to build up over it and then becomes fossilized. No, it falls over, and if it was fossilized, it would be on the ground and fossilized on the ground. So this shows that this tree was still standing or was floating in an upright position, which we know happened because of what happened at Mount St. Helens. And then it petrified the rock and everything. So that's evidence of rapid burial that fits a biblical flood. Another thing we can point out is, notice in these layers, if it took vast amount of ages, where's the little gullies? Where's the little gullies? And because this layer, if there was a gully that washed off here, this layer should be filling that gully down here. And all of these seams you see in almost every place. In fact, I've looked for several years and I've never seen a gully in the layers where a highway goes through a hill or something like that. They're always just straight and level. That's indications that they were laid down at the same time. Okay, and this is a Kaibab uplift. This would be the dam that held back water from the Grand Canyon. And this was a whole plateau that rose up, not just the mountains rose up and the valley sank down, but a plateau rose up, causing this to trap water probably. this is a picture of that. And there's two men there to give you some scale. And what I want you to notice is that these layers are bent. They're not broken. And even over here where it's a sharp bend up, it's not really broken. They're bent. And so that would indicate that these sediments were relatively soft because they were laid down at the same time, or, one after the other during the flood. And then where the Bible talks about the mountains rose up, the valley sank down, there it is, and it bent them, it didn't break them. I've been told that even secular geologists say where there's a mixture of the two materials here, the red and the white, that means those layers were laid down consecutively pretty within, the same amount of time because of mixing materials. We get to the Grand Canyon, did a little bit of water over a lot of time form the Grand Canyon, or a lot of water in a short time. So this is that Kaibab upward that we saw the pictures of right here, and that plateau would extend at least for a ways. I don't know how far here, but notice this huge lake, or several lakes actually. They've named those lakes because they can see the ancient shorelines. And then probably there was a lot more water towards the end of the flood because the oceans were very warm compared to what they are now, and there'd been a lot more evaporation. Therefore, there'd be a lot more rainfall, and eventually those things built up to where they broke through here. I've been told that over around San Diego, there is a mixture of the material that comes out of the Grand Canyon. And so the water came, and as the velocity slowed down as it went that far, it began to drop those over in the San Diego area or east of it, and dropped it out. And eventually there was enough. The water flow probably lessened, and the velocity lessened, and the buildup of sediments, and then it turned and goes down to the Gulf of California where it is now. To demonstrate how violent or how corrosive water can be, I believe this was Hoover Dam. There was a lot of snow in the wintertime, and then early spring it warmed up and there was a lot of rain. And so here come all that's, not all of it, but really quickly, that snow began to melt and come down through there, and they were afraid it was going to overtop the dam and wash it out. So this is an overflow tube of that, and they opened it up, and they kept opening it up more and more and more. And they finally said, well, go ahead and open it all the way up because we're afraid the dam's going to wash out. And then all of a sudden, the water where it was coming out just turned red. So it shut it down. And within 15 minutes, it had washed through 3 feet of steel reinforced concrete and carved out a cavity about the size of a basketball court. So there's tremendous erosion. So that water, those lakes up above where the Grand Canyon is, probably washed it out very quickly. Okay, let's look at the Ice Age. Now, we've seen this picture before about the fountains of the deep breaking open, and Walt Brown, he says that he thinks there was enough pressure and velocity of that fountain of the deep breaking open that some of it would have went above the atmosphere, and up there it's 250 degrees below zero, and so it was immediately frozen. Ice can be magnetized, so it tended to be pulled towards the poles. Now, the thing is there any evidence for this? Well, in Russia, this is in Walt Brown's book, in Russia, they were blasting, using dynamite to make a road or something. And all of a sudden, here was this lake or a riverbed that had dirt on top of it. And then it was frozen, and the fish were frozen up in the water. Now, conditions today, the ice would have frozen here and become thicker and thicker. And then as the ice became thicker, the fish would swim closer and closer to the floor. And if it froze solid, they should be frozen at the bottom instead of suspended up in this part. And the ice is very clear, which would indicate it was frozen very quickly also. Another example that kind of supports Walt Brown's theory is that this expedition in 1846 went to make camp, and when they were making camp, they noticed these black spots out in the lake, and there were like vultures and birds that was kind of flying around pecking on this. And so the next morning they went to inspect it and see what it was, and they said it was oxen, and the ice was so clear that they could see the position of the feet of the oxen, and they were just swimming along, and it's just like they got frozen. So that's further evidence that it was they were froze very quickly, different than what would be conditions today. Now, another thing important is if the Bible's true, we should find evidence of the ice age mentioned in the Bible. So here we go. This is in Job chapter 38. Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? The waters hide themselves and become like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Now, the book of Job, at least the Bible scholars I've heard, said that Job was probably the first book that was written, and at least the time frame would be shortly or not too long after the flood, which would be about the time that ice age would have been occurring. And this is a chart of the average ages, and the average age before the flood, here's the flood, is 911 years. Like Noah lived a total of 900 and some years. Shem lived a total of 600 years. The next generations, or I don't know, might be more than one, but the next few lived about 400, the next few about 200. And since it appears that Job would have been probably in this 200 range, this is about where things were. And notice Peleg, where he's at. And I might mention of him later if I have time. When did the ice age occur? Probably about 4,500 years ago, which would be shortly after the flood. The biblical flood is the perfect recipe for an ice age. The things that I've read said that the secular world has a hard time coming up with severe enough weather patterns and everything to even form an ice age. But the Bible, we have that. Let's look at it. An ice age needs warm oceans and cold land masses. Well, if you have the fountains of the deep releasing water from 10 to 30 miles deep, that water would be extremely hot. And then you've also got thousands of volcanoes going off, erupting magma that would be somewhere between 1,200 and over 2,000 degrees. That would definitely warm the oceans. They'd have been much, much, much warmer. And by the way, most of the stuff I've read said most of the water from the flood came from the fountains of the deep, not just rain. And so other creationists say that there's maybe one continent that covered 2/3 of the earth before the flood, and there was a third that was water, and now it's 2/3 water and a third land. Now, the volcanic ash in the atmosphere from these thousands of volcanoes going off would block the sun, causing cold land masses. And then the evaporating water over the warm oceans are then blown over the cold land masses, causing rapid buildup of the snow on the continents. Secular science says there were multiple ice ages. But it's possible, well, some say up to 30 ice ages, but summer meltbacks may account for the multiple ice ages, particularly maybe towards the latter part of the ice age when there was a lot more shrink back because the continents were starting to warm up in the summer more than they had in the past. Now, one of the things that I want to get to, said I'd get into the ancient maps, and this is where that gets. I get into that. I ran into a problem putting the flood, the Ice Age, and the Bible together. However, I have a problem there, and that was true, but the evolutionists, they have a greater problem than I've got. But I won't worry about their problem. I'm going to worry about my problem. So ancient maps showed land bridges and no ice or little ice on Antarctica. And see, I was always taught that the buildup of the Ice Age lowered the ocean levels because all the water was within the ice caps. So I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't put it together. Okay, this is a map, and notice Antarctica is here, and that is the exact shape of Antarctica. And then this is South America here. Now, it is larger than it should be, according to the, like Africa and some of these other places, but it is the exact shape. The mountain ranges are in the right locations, and the rivers are in the right places. And guess what? Well, modern geology says that Antarctica has been covered with ice for at least 1 million years. This map was made in 1531. So it's like, how did he know what the shape of Antarctica was? Now, this map shows accurately mountain ranges and rivers now under more than 1 mile of ice. Some of these mountain ranges were not discovered until 1957, at least by us, or I would say modern people. And then remember, according to secular geology, Antarctica has been covered with ice for at least 1 million years. So there's a problem there. Now the Piri-Reis map is another map. And this is a picture of it on the left part of the screen. And you will see, here's the Horn of Africa. It's on a gazelle skin. This is South America. And this is part of Antarctica down here. And of course, North America is up here. Now this writing here, he says that he copied it from other maps. So he listed these maps. One of them dated back to 400 BC, and that map was probably made from previous maps also. So, that's why it's here. The other thing I want to quickly mention is latitude and longitude. And I believe I've got it correct. Back at the time when these maps were made, the tool for longitude had not been invented yet, at least in that time period. But the longitude on these maps, which would be the distance, I think, between here and here, is exactly right. And so how did they do that unless they had instruments in the past back there that they didn't have in the 1500s when these maps were made? This accurately shows the coastline of Antarctica. And in fact, this one book I read, Secret of the Lost Races, said that there was actually a discrepancy between the modern maps of the coastline of Antarctica to this map. And so somebody, I don't know that it was its author, but somebody saw the discrepancy. So they had them remeasure it, and they probably measured it with satellites rather than sonar. And guess which map was right? The ancient map. So they had to have seen that coastline. There was not an ice shelf over it. The map was made in 1513, but Antarctica's, oops, I got a misspelling there, existence was not verified until 1819. The original map had to be before the Ice Age. There might have been some ice on it, but evidently he could still, whoever explored it could see the mountain ranges and the rivers and everything that was there. Remember Peleg? back there. It's possible in that book, Secret of the Lost Races, he said that Peleg, I've heard two things on that. Some say that's when the continents were divided, which probably means when the ocean levels rose enough that the land bridges, were gone by that time, maybe. And the other one is this one guy said in this book that his name could mean like he measured out the earth. In other words, it might have been that generation way back there had the technology and the know-how to explore this new world that they lived on after the flood and drew Antarctica and some of these other maps in detail and accurately. Another map is Haji Ahmed, which was made in 1559. This is not that map, but this illustrates what he talked about or was on his map, and that is a land bridge between Russia and Siberia. And I think it said that it was about 600 miles land bridge there. So there's the land bridge. How could there be land bridges and little or no ice on Antarctica? Uh-oh, what'd I do? Screen. I'm glad Caleb's here.
Something happened.
Yeah, I know. It happened on my end too. We should be getting close. Is that better?
We still don't see the presentation. Okay, now we do. No, we
Hey.
don't. You see me talking.
Okay.
Caleb, are you there?
Yeah.
He's working on it
Okay, thank you.
as quick as he can.
No, it's okay. This is very interesting.
It says
I'm-
it's recording.
What's that?
It's
Okay.
back.
Now let's click over here, right?
Yep.
Okay, now I should be able to go on. How could there be land bridges and little or no ice on Antarctica? Here's a possible biblical solution, and you've got to watch this solution because I came up with this solution. Okay, so you check it out. There's that fountains of the deep breaking open, and then there's where the continents are, and the continents slid. And remember where it says the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down? Well, is it possible that when those mountains rose up and even the Kaibab upwarp of that plateau, that it trapped vast amounts of water on the continents, and to where there was a lot more water there than we have today? And there's one over in India. I've got a picture I didn't put in there of a large lake about right there that has been drained sometime after the flood. So I guess that, I think, is my answer, that large, a lot of water was trapped on the continent shortly after the flood when the mountains rose up and the valley sank down. And here's like an example. We saw this picture, that water there. Here's an overlay of another one, there. And so there was a lot of water just in, these two lakes that are here are actually 5 lakes. Another thing that tells us that there was larger amounts of water. See, there's no way that this water flow scoured, the land clear of the sediments here. It had to be a larger amount of water at one time that did this. And take note, we will see this picture going the other direction. Take note of this fence and cement pad. Now here, on the Snake River Plain, which is where that other picture was taken, these rocks are all rounded. And I got this from David Nutty and his presentation. And he said what he thinks has happened is that somewhere above here, there was a large lake that ended up overflowing, and initially it started tearing out rocks and rolling them across the ground. And again, the further they went, the velocity slowed down. It didn't have the capacity to keep rolling them down, so it dropped them. And then also probably the canyon began to get cut down and take the flow of water. And so that might be another reason why they're there. Now, remember this platform, and the dam and the waterfalls are, to the bottom of the screen. And then there's the canyon. And then notice where these rocks are. They're up on top here. So that seems to fit what I was sharing. And to me, it fits what David Nutting was sharing. Here we have the Grand Canyon. We saw that and the tremendous pressure that's there. Another in Science News, I got this from David Nutting also. There was a giant flood down the Mississippi River that he said, or in this, where he found this, it was raised by 10 inches worldwide. So that was a tremendous amount of water. So that really shows that, to me, my possible solution, could have happened, could account for the land bridges and little or no water or ice on Antarctica. Now, here's some other evidence. Remember, we're looking at the old lady and the young lady on the same picture. There's evidence that the layers on Greenland are not 100,000 years old. And this is ice core drillings in Greenland, these little yellow dots here. And they go down and they count 100,000 rings, or they say 100,000 years of ice buildup there. However, we know this is not true because of the Lost Squadron. And by the way, we're connected with another museum there in Haviland, and Dr. Simmons gave a presentation in Kansas there, and he met an older man, probably older than me by quite a bit, but he was on that mission. So I'd really like to talk to him here one of these days. Anyway, the squadron, they took off from over here, and they probably refueled either here or here, and then they went to proceed over to get into the war over in Europe. And I don't know what happened, but they were afraid they'd get trapped with no fuel out in the ocean. And so they ended up turning around and landing on the ice there. Well, this plane here, this twin fuselage fighter plane, is extremely rare. So this one man, he decided, I might keep doing that. We're working on it. That's good. That's good for now. Okay. I'm sure glad Caleb's here. That's okay. Okay, we should be there now. Okay. So he decided, I'm going to go over to Greenland and I'm going to get at least one of those planes. So he went over there and they weren't visible. And so he figured, well, they're probably under a few feet of snow and ice here. So they got sonar equipment and they finally found them. And when they located them, they were 263 feet down in 48 years. So they used hot water and made a shaft going down to them, took them apart piece by piece and took them back up. And then I guess he got his plane. But when he was asked, and I think Kent Hovind, which is where I got that slide, said he talked to the man that, did this project and said that there were hundreds of layers in 48 years, hundreds of layers. Well, that would mean that those layers in those ice cores are not annual rings. They have to be storms or, different temperatures, that happens through winters and summers or whatever. It's not annual rings. That's the main thing we need to know. So at this whole presentations, I hope I've given you evidence that we can see this young, pretty lady here. And that when we look at the layers in the earth and the geologic column and the animals that are there, that's trapped in there, it's probably, they were buried during Noah's flood. The layers were built up during Noah's flood, and the mountains were built up towards the end of the flood. And so I think that's it. If you have any questions, I think I'm ready if I've got any time. What do I do? Stop share?
Yeah, you can just stop share, and then we definitely have some questions for you, Stan. That was a great presentation, but it brought up some questions that people have. So let's get started with those. The first one, June asks, how cold does a river need to be to flash freeze? Yeah, how cold does it need to be to flash freeze a river?
Well, I don't know. Well, according to Walt Brown, he said that ice would have been 250 degrees below zero. So I would, as far as I know, that's the only answer I could give would be the 250 degrees below zero.
Okay. And then you had talked about a river in Russia.
Yes.
Can you be more specific about where that is? Robin's curious about why she's never heard about that before. She's never heard somebody talk about that one.
Okay. Well, all I can tell you is if you go online to Dr. Walt Brown's book, in the beginning, it will be in that book. And exactly where it is in Russia, I do not know. And I'm not sure if it was a river or a lake.
But it's in Walt's book. I'll look for it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And then June also wants to know what people group was making maps in 400 BC. How could they see the coastlines to create the map?
Well, I think that Noah and his kids, I think they were way smarter than we are today. For one thing, I think we're devolving instead of evolving personally. And I think they had the capability of, going around the earth, probably sent teams out, and they maybe even explored Antarctica. And, they had ways of evidently measuring to some degree because they got the shape right. Does that answer it or re-ask it?
I think she's saying, she said in 400 BC, so they were copying previous.
Oh, yeah. Okay. My wife's correcting me. I didn't maybe understand the question. Probably that 400 BC map was made from people back in about Peleg's day. And that's a guess. We're guessing, but there were previous maps shortly after the flood. I think those people explored the new planet they were on and made somewhat accurate maps anyway. Does that answer?
I think so. And
Okay.
then Sarah Buckland, who's actually going to be one of our upcoming speakers in a few weeks, she has some questions for you that she's going to ask herself. So Sarah, if you're ready, you could go ahead and do that.
Lighting is good right now, but yes. So my questions, well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. My first question was really on what's the best evidence that you could really explain to a geologist to basically convince them that each layer of ice in the ice core does not represent a year, because that was one thing I was taught, because I did geography, and we were taught, we actually had to be doing graphs where we correlated, or we were taught that they know that these represent
Yearly
like
rain?
600 years in Antarctica. And so we actually had graphs of oxygen isotopes that were supposed to be proxies for temperature changes in history. And then you saw the cycles from the oxygen concentrations in the ice. And they had the time scale of 100,000 year cycles with the different ups and downs, and then they had the minimal cycle, and they said, okay, these are evidences that these time scales are right because the ice cores have these cycles. But basically, I know that there are assumptions what they have taught us. So I just wanted to see what's the best answer to show them that this is really flawed.
Okay,
I hope
so
that's I was
question, I was having a hard time understanding some of, you're talking about the ice core or the ice rings.
Right.
And that the ice rings, from your study, they were actually yearly rings, right?
That's what we were taught. That's
Yes.
how they dated them. They were dated because each layer represents an annual layer.
Okay,
So I questioned my lecturer about
Okay.
this, and they said, yes, this is how we know that the ages of these actually have the timelines to map out the cycles to, for example, decipher the differences in Earth's temperature, for example, in whatever time.
well,
But
there's got to be some assumptions that are wrong because we know by observation of those planes being 263 feet down in 48 years, there should be only 48 layers,
okay,
and there's hundreds. So
Right.
something has to be wrong with the assumptions that they're annual rings, because observational science shows us that that can't be true. And I have to add a little bit, and I'm sure you're aware of this more than me, but the further down you go, there's more compaction because of the weight, and it gets harder and harder to detect the rings. There was, I can't remember, there's another slide that goes into it that I didn't put in, and but it puts the ice age in relatively in the time period of coming right after the flood. I could try and find that slide and give the details, but to you. But there's some assumptions there also. I admit that. But we know they're not annual rings because observational science shows us that there's hundreds of rings in 48 years. To me, would be the main answer.
Do you believe they're freezing and thawing rings?
I don't know what they are. All I know is they're not annual rings because of observation, in my opinion.
right. I wasn't aware of this. Right. Thank you so much. So, right, the artifacts of the buried planes, I think that is a very powerful evidence because we know when they crashed. And so, yeah, thank you very much. I've been noticing
You
that.
bet. That was an
I
interesting
appreciate it.
question.
And then I think you kind of touched on our next question, which comes from Julianne about how long after the flood, how long between the time after the flood to the start of the ice age.
Well, I think it would have immediately started, and possibly even, well, see, that ice that would have frozen the fish suspended and the oxen would have been during the flood because there were sediments on top of that frozen lake. So some of it would have probably started during the flood somehow. And do I have all the answers? No. But I think shortly after it for sure was starting. And there's some evidence that it maybe you were getting ice dropping or, ice and snow dropping maybe towards the latter part of the flood.
Okay. Well, that seems to be the end of our questions for now. So if you, Stan, if you'd like to give a little more information about yourself. I'm thinking that you don't have a website, but if you have a website or any kind of materials that you have available for purchase or a way that people can get in touch with you if they have more questions or anything like that.
Okay. Well, the only thing I can on Facebook under Stan Bryant, from Kansas. I don't know, think there's too many in Kansas anyway, My wife and I have a little museum, creation museum. We put it next to the church. And so there's some pictures from there. And
On Google Maps too.
and it's on, Caleb's starting to get me on Google Maps, but I guess we don't have all the pictures and stuff up yet. But that's one aspect, and I have been, well, I think by now I've probably been sharing for about 25 years, and we are involved in that museum over at Haviland, which when it's completed, which we're about 2/3 done, with the construction anyway, it'll be about 8,000 square feet when it's finished. So it's a
Wow.
major one for us.
Yeah.
Stan, this is Robin. You had mentioned on the phone to me about Utica and a dig. Now, there's some ladies on Diane and June. They've been to Utica to that dig, and you said there was another one.
Yes, I think I just got an email sometime in September. David Reeves is going to be having a dig out there at the ranch at Utica.
Oh, I thought there was one that you did that was like $10 or something.
Oh, well, I can just take groups up and we can pick things up off the ground. And then, usually it's homeschool groups and stuff like that. And, we have pop rocks and, scales and stuff but if we have what we think's a major find, I have to leave that for the big boys.
Okay, so all right. So Diane and June there, that was because Stan's been there and Diane and June, and they're going to be going to David's dig, and I'm hoping to go to David's dig this year. I was supposed to go last year, but some family things came up and I couldn't.
Okay, I'll be anxious to meet all of you guys that come.
Okay, well, once again, we are Creation Fellowship Santee, and people can find our videos on our YouTube channel just by searching for Creation Fellowship Santee. And then also our Facebook page is Creation Fellowship Santee, and our email address, creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. We don't solicit, we don't
Spam, no spam.
no spam. And so we just send out our links for our upcoming speakers. So if you want to email us and get on that list, be sure to do that. So thank you, Stan, for sharing with us. We're going to go ahead and turn off the camera and the live feed. And then I think maybe a couple of people might have questions